welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica, and I am here with an author who is from the New York area and has written a really interesting book.
Okay, so I am Erin Swan. I have written the book Walk the Vanished Earth. And in a nutshell, this book is a family saga that begins with a bison hunter in Kansas in 1873 and ends on Mars 200 years later with one of his descendants.
So first of all, the book is called Walk the Vanished Earth, and it has one of the most beautiful covers I have ever seen in my life. It's so haunting and so perfect for this book. Did you have any input on that?
I did, yeah, they were very nice. And they asked me some input like before they went to the art directors about what kinds of things I liked, what kinds of things I didn't like. And one big piece of input I had was I wanted something round on the cover. And they just did, Elizabeth Yaffe did the most amazing job. So we just scored big time with that cover. I love the cover so much.
It's so nice. Win. Yeah, I don't think it's really fair when people say don't judge a book by its cover, because the cover really
definitely not.
But the book itself is also really interesting, and it's so haunting, and it is like it's a story about family trauma, but it's also a story about like environmental trauma, and also the impact that has on generations. And it goes back and forth from like the 1800s to decades and decades in the future, on another planet. And one of the things I was curious about was how you decided what the time periods were going to be. You know, like the first story, or the very beginning of this family story, was with the bison hunter in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And it definitely worked, but I was curious, like from his story, Samson, like how did you decide, okay, the next stop is going to be this stop, and then we're going, like where did you decide that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because actually, writing a book is a very messy process, and writing this book was a very messy process. So originally the book was a short story only centered on the character B, and then I decided to expand it. So originally it only took place in 1975, and then I envisioned it as moving in a linear direction, with her child and then his child and then that person's child. And so there were 4 generations originally, moving fairly chronologically. And then it got into the hands of the agents, and they exploded it in the most fun and most exciting way. And I think before I had given it to them, I also had Samson. So there was, at some point, I was reading a lot of Little House on the Prairie books, and thinking a lot about, westward expansion and the American dream and the frontier. And I just devised this bison hunter character, which to me fit really, really well with the environmental issues in the book, right? Because, I read these journals about bison hunters and just thinking about the vast quantities of animals they would kill. And within, I think, like the span of a year or two, we had decimated, a very large portion of that population. And so he seems like a perfect origin story for this family. And then I thought it seemed natural to start the book with him and end the book with him. And then the other characters evolved through the revision process, and we started layering them in and moving them around. And I think one of the final decisions was to decide to, right after Samson's story in the 1800s, to go immediately to the story furthest in the future, just so readers weren't tricked into thinking they were getting straight historical fiction, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then B's story is just so difficult to read, but you do it in such a sensitive way. B is she's 11 or 12 years old, and she's pregnant,
Yeah, I
And
think she's 12, but of course nobody knows for sure.
right, that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah, and everybody can tell that she's very young, and
Hmm.
clearly there's a trauma. I mean,
Definitely. There's a trauma.
12-year-olds shouldn't be pregnant.
Absolutely not. No.
And where she came from and who her family is. Were you sort of inspired by stories of things like this happening? Why from
Hmm.
Samson's own story, he left his country and his father um, was not pleasant, and
Yep.
then his son feeds into the next story.
Hmm.
Um, Bee's story it's almost like sort of like the back and forth, like, well, you
Hmm.
have this character that began and came from really horrible beginnings and decided, like, well, I'm going to have a family and it's going to go better, but then it's almost like the scales tip, and then we move to where B came from.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think I was very interested in the idea of, generational trauma and, certain studies that have been done about trauma getting actually like lodged in our DNA somehow. Like I thought that was really intriguing to explore. And so instead of Samson's family turning out as this perfect, American family living happily ever after, which of course is his big dream, when he wants to start everything, instead he gets this son that seems to be an echo of his own father, and then foists his, deranged ideas onto his daughter, who is in such a terrible predicament. So just the idea of like how, how families and how parents, and all of us can continue these kinds of traumas and these kinds of tragedies and these kinds of, distorted ways of viewing the world, I thought was really interesting to explore. And B seems the perfect character with which to do that, because she's complicated, right?
Yeah.
She doesn't follow a straight path, and her dreams are not particularly following a straight path either.
Yeah, and I think that, it matches very well with just the story of the environment. People came to this continent with this idea that, well, we own this now, even though it's
Mm-hmm.
belonged to other people
Indeed.
forever.
Yes.
But now it's like, well, now we're here and we're
Mm-hmm.
colonizing, and that whole idea of manifest destiny, and
Mm-hmm.
that this land is ours by but because of the right of God, or however.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just sort of take everything, and it ends up eventually taking everything in a different way from future generations. And when we get to Bee's child story, it gets
Yes.
into a lot of the environmental stuff, which feels very tangible and was
Mm-hmm.
extremely scary.
It was scary. Yeah. So Paul's part, the 2017 part, I was writing in 2017. So everything that was happening, in our climate at the time, there were some really extreme hurricanes at the time. I remember there were fires in California, there were mudslides like that year. Not like it was necessarily different than any other year, right? Especially now. But being able to write those things while they were happening made them seem so much more fraught and so much more intense and scary, right? As they should be.
Right, of course. And and then, like, when you go a little bit further to his child, it
Mm-hmm.
intensified a lot, and it's
Yes.
like, again, echoed in these warnings that you keep hearing, and it's counterproductive. So, like, you have this family that began 1800s westward expansion,
Mm-hmm.
and it just it doesn't improve in the way I think that it was originally meant to be. But there's a lot of tender moments in there,
Mm-hmm.
especially, when B eventually does connect with Paul, even though it's not
Yeah.
what necessarily he would have imagined.
Yeah.
It was very heartfelt.
It was one of my favorite scenes, I think, to write. I don't know. It
Right.
just felt like I really wanted them to reunite so badly. And it was such a painful and joyful reunion for both of them that I was it felt good to write that scene. It felt important.
There was also just like some interesting mythological aspects woven in, like Bee believing like she was going to give birth to a giant, and that her father was a deer.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say that I pulled those ideas from actual myths, but I did not. They just seem to occur, right? So the deer, I mean, I guess I was seeing a lot of deer at the time. I had this cabin in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of deer there. And so that wove itself in. And then, her mother telling her that her father was a deer was, her mother maybe trying to distance herself from this man who basically kidnapped her, right? And completely, realigned her life to something very, very disastrous. And then the giant thing, I mean, that also came from Bee's father. Like he was trying to go against Samson, his father, right? And his father's dreams for like an ordinary American life. And then Robert Sampson's like, no, we're going to make a whole new species, like he calls it a breed. We're going to make this whole new thing, and it's going to be giants, and they're going to be amazing, and they're going to take over the earth, right? And so Bee believes this because what else, she doesn't know anything else, right? And I think that's part of the big tragedy that is her character, is that her whole life is dictated by this man who appropriated her mother's life and therefore appropriated hers, right?
Yeah, it was very cult-like.
Very cult-like.
The cult itself.
But there's nobody there.
Right, exactly. Like it was cults-ish within the family.
Yeah.
And I got the sense that maybe it could have been bigger if he wasn't as much of a recluse as he was.
Right. He just wants to live in his terrible shack in the desert and, hunt his deer and raise his awful family. Yeah.
But when you get to the furthest in the future with Moon and the uncles, the language was very beautiful and delicately written throughout the story, but just like the distance that was felt from, like this is a post-human world. Yes. When you get there, it was otherworldly. Did you write the stories side by side, or did you write them, all over the place like they were published?
Yeah, the Moon sections were the final sections that I wrote, and they actually went through multiple drafts. She was a very hard character to develop, to conceive of, and then to develop. So yeah, her chapters, like the chapters of hers that punctuate or I don't know, peppered the book, I suppose, came towards the end, right? So I think I was very, like when I was writing those, they were cohesive to me, and then I was slotting them into the manuscript as it existed then. And so that's probably why they feel to some extent different from, the B sections, which originally had been written a few years before.
It worked for the type of story it was. It definitely worked because the voice did feel very different. Regardless of the time period, the other character stories felt very grounded to Earth. And Moon's story did, the language and just the way that the characters interacted with each other, and the way that Moon sort of perceived everything was alien, which worked for the type of story that hers was.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of that was, it was very hard to write a alien. I had never done that before. And somebody who's also partly human and has no idea what's going on and has no frame of reference beyond her immediate surroundings. So I think I actually, once I figured out the story that I wanted to tell with Moon, those sections were a lot of fun to write. I like to think they're a little bit funny. I don't know if anybody else will think so, but I thought there were a few little jokes in there, like the cartoons and everything.
Yeah, that was something I was thinking of, like when her uncles, just for the listeners, are like, oh, we have to entertain her, we're going to show her cartoons, and this is someone who's never grown up, this is like a young girl on the cusp of physical womanhood, not necessarily, emotional or mental, but never having seen this before. Her whole life, the only beings she's known are these two uncles that raise her and talk about humans in the past
Mhm.
tense, and then it's just like, well, we're going to give her a tablet and she's going to watch cartoons.
Right. And she's like, these are boring. Like, I don't
Right.
care. There's nothing like there's nothing here for me. And then she starts trying to figure it out. Right.
Yeah, it was one of the things I really liked about that also was when she's watching it, the characters take on like almost like a mythical quality,
Mhm.
which I like very much because I kind of would imagine, if people were to look back on, say, Bugs Bunny,
Right.
which, I mean, we're going back a really long time now. He might be regarded as almost like a Reynard the Fox type character, like a
Right.
trickster god,
Mhm.
like eh, thousands of years from now, people are like, regarding these stories, and it's almost mythological in quality because
Mhm.
the scenarios are similar, but with similar characters. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It was fun to make it seem, because they're so ordinary to us, right? But I
right.
thought,
Yeah.
right, but to her they wouldn't be. And then, to put Marvin the Martian in there was just a cute
Oh
little joke
yes,
on my part.
he's one of my absolute favorites, actually. I really love him.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess the rest of the book felt so serious at times that I was like, I need to joke around a little bit.
So about the fact that it did feel very serious, I'm kind of looking at it, and it's talked about, a little bit historical fiction, mostly science fiction, some fantasy
Mhm.
aspects of it. The themes of dreams come up a lot. Motherhood comes up a lot.
Oh, yes. Yes. That is the
Um,
center.
it's almost like hope dystopia, though, because there's
This
not
new genre.
there's not there's sadness and there's distance, but there's just like maybe a little seed that there
Yeah.
is a possibility for the
Yeah.
future.
For sure. Yeah. But there's a different way to live, or there's a different way to envision how we occupy this land that we're on, and how we deal with it and how we interact with it. Yeah, I definitely wanted to weave that in through there. That it's not all doom and gloom.
But going back to the themes of motherhood,
Hmm.
it's a complicated subject. And
Always. Yeah, I think as I went through, each generation and each parent-child relationship, motherhood was definitely something that was on my mind because, as I'm writing this book, I'm a person who is not a mother, and who does not intend to be one. And so that's very much on my mind. And as I was writing this book, a lot of my friends are having children. Obviously this is a thing that people talk to women a lot about, when you're going to have kids, all this stuff. My students ask me this all the time.
assume that clearly
Right.
because you have this biology, or you seem to have this
Hmm.
biology, that is what you need to do with it.
Right. And so I've pushed back against that my
Yeah.
entire adult life. And so as I'm writing this book, the book for me became a real exploration of all of my complicated feelings certainly about my own mother. Definitely. This is very much a book about her in very like subtle ways that probably nobody will get but myself. And thinking about myself and why I've made this choice for myself, and all the feelings that go along with it, right? And none of those feelings are ever simple, I think, for anybody, because motherhood is not simple at all, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is for sure.
Yeah.
So what are some of your own favorite sci-fi books or dystopian books?
Sure. Yeah. I love dystopian books. I was just writing about one recently. It was actually a Jonathan Lethem book called Girl in Landscape. Super weird, wonderful, like literary. Do you know the book? It's very cool. Yeah. The planet is destroyed. They go to this other planet. There's like these alien creatures there and this crumbling civilization. And it's a coming of age story of a young girl. That was a really cool book. Of course, I love the old school ones like, Brave New World, 1984. Handmaid's Tale for sure was huge for me. Huge influence for this, right? Definitely in the sections on Mars with the Red Star Project.
Oh yes. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I've read that book a gazillion times. I've taught it numerous times. Um, and other ones that come to mind, so many of them. I read one recently called How High We Go in the Dark, which is great. I'm sure you've heard of it. Yeah. And there's a YA book, a young adult book called Feed that I really love. That was published like 20 years ago or something.
I'm really messed up by the fact that you said that, because I was I've been getting my career as a librarian around the time that book
Oh,
came out.
2003. Yeah. Yeah. That's when
Roughly
it came out.
2003. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it just feels like time goes by very quickly.
Doesn't it? I know.
Yeah.
And at that time, right, we're like, chips in our brains that will give us anything we wanted. And that was before social media and like the internet as we know it today. So I thought that book was just very cool.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely was. I actually liked City of Ember,
Oh, I haven't read
which
it.
is great.
Cool. I'll
It's
put it on
great.
my list.
Yeah, it's middle grade, but I don't want to say too much about it. But that was a book that I didn't realize what was going on until something happened. And then I was like, oh, okay, this is what's happening. But
Cool.
I think after reading a lot of books like that, I can pick it up. But, that was, again, very early in my career.
Right.
And,
Yes.
still learning all that. Well,
Yeah.
thank you a lot for chatting with us. Are you writing something else at the moment?
I am. Whether or not it will be book 2, obviously remains to be seen. But right now I'm working on a ghost story.
I love ghost stories.
I love ghost stories. All I ever want to watch is movies or like haunted house movies. So I've decided to write the haunted house book, movie, whatever, that I want to read and watch.
Excellent.
Yes.
Well, I would very much like to read that when it comes out.
Hopefully it becomes a thing. Yes, I will keep working.
Well, once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest today was
Erin Swan,
and
author of Walk the Vanish Earth.
Author of Walk to the Vanished Earth,
Yes.
which is a beautiful book with one of the most beautiful covers you will ever see. You
Definitely
will want to read the book, and you will want to make a poster of the cover.
I want a poster of the cover.
It's so pretty.
Yeah,
and
they got to send me one.
The contents of it definitely, work with the cover. So we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.